Boldwood presents Downfall, written by Kerry Kaya and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue 2004. A shiver of fear ran down the length of 8-year-old Carla Carter's spine. Never before had she seen her father look so angry. Of course there had been times when he'd been annoyed, when he would raise his voice or give his wife the look, the one to warn her she was going too far and was starting to make an exhibition of herself, which, as it just so happened, she liked to do often. By her own admission, Diane Carter had a big mouth, one that she wasn't afraid to use. She'd never been the type of woman to keep her opinions to herself, and as a result, was forever getting into slanging matches. More often than not, if it wasn't her husband on the receiving end of Diane's sharp tongue, then it was his family, or her daughter, or one of their long-suffering neighbours. After one particularly nasty argument, Carla's father, Sonny, had slammed out of the house and not returned home for 3 days. But never had he been so livid that he'd screamed and hollered blue murder before going on to destroy his and Diane's bedroom. From her hiding place, at the top of the stairs, Carla bit down on her bottom lip, tears spilling down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, her daddy was beginning to frighten her. Each and every time she heard a loud thud or the sound of glass breaking, no doubt her mother's expensive perfume bottles being thrown against the wall, she would physically jump out of her skin, afraid that her parents were actually going to kill one another. That this time there would be no kissing and making up. That this time her father really would leave the house and never come back. As the shouts became even louder and her mother's shrieks for him to get out of the house and leave her alone became more desperate, Carla was in half a mind to run back to her bedroom, screw her eyes shut tight, and place her hands over her ears in an attempt to block out the noise. She wanted them to stop, wanted to see her mum smile again, and for her dad to do something silly to make them both laugh, just as he used to do in the past, when they'd been happy. Only it had been a long time since she'd seen her mum smile, at least a genuine one anyway. Although it would be fair to say that she smiled often whenever her dad's friend Bernie Adams popped over, and he'd been coming over a lot recently, especially when her dad wasn't home. Bernie and her mum would spend hours in her parents' bedroom, talking and listening to music, not that they allowed Carla to join in. Her mum would even slide the bolt across the door to keep her locked out. As the door to her parents' room swung wide open, Carla dug her nails into the palms of her hands and held her breath. Was her daddy still angry? Stepping out of the bedroom, she saw that the colour had drained from Sonny Carter's face. The muscles across his shoulder blades taut and his knuckles bloody. "Daddy?" Swallowing down the large lump in her throat, Carla's voice cracked, terror getting the better of her as she stared down at the holdall in her father's hand. "Don't go, Daddy! Please don't leave!" she cried, running to him and tugging on the bag in a desperate attempt to take it away from him and to make him stay. Sonny gave a loud sigh, and sinking down to his haunches, he pulled his daughter close, the familiar scent of his cologne, combined with body wash and shampoo, bringing her comfort. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." He gave a sad smile and kissed the top of his daughter's head. "I'll only be gone for a little while, just until things have calmed down a bit between me and your mum." He glanced over his shoulder, glaring at his wife, his eyes hard, and his expression set like thunder. "I'll be back soon. You just wait and see. And until then you can come and see me every weekend. How does that sound? You'd like that, wouldn't you? You'd be able to spend some time with your cousins." Carla began to sob. She didn't want her daddy to go, and she didn't care about spending time with her stupid cousins. It wasn't as though they ever allowed her to play with them, and more often than not would exclude her from their games, telling her that girls weren't allowed to play football or pretend to shoot guns. Even more than that, she didn't want to stay in the house with just her mum for company. Her mum never wanted to play with her, and all she ever wanted to do was talk to Bernie, and Carla didn't like Bernie, at least not anymore. She didn't like the way her mum behaved around him, the way she would hang off his every word and bat her eyelashes at him. She even laughed at his stupid jokes. It was all his fault that her daddy was leaving. She knew it was. She'd heard everything that had been said between her parents, even if she didn't fully understand the words they had used. Maybe her daddy was mad at her too. Mad because she told him about the times Bernie had visited. It was supposed to have been a secret, something her daddy was never meant to have found out about. That's right. Amidst the destruction of the bedroom, Diane Carter swiped the smeared mascara from underneath her eyes and gave a sarcastic laugh. The crocodile tears she'd put on moments earlier all too quickly evaporated, causing her beautiful face to turn ugly. "Tell her more lies!" She turned then to look at her daughter with a wicked gleam in her eyes. "He isn't coming back. In fact," she crossed her arms over her chest, her lips twisting into a cruel smile, "you're going to have a new daddy." Sonny jumped to his feet so fast that Carla toppled to the floor, and as she landed on the thick carpet with a bump, she howled from a mixture of both shock and fear. It was so typical of her mum. She was forever goading her dad, forever trying to make him angry. For what reason, Carla didn't know. Her daddy was lovely, the kindest man she had ever known. He would even come home from work early just so that he could read her a bedtime story, something her mum never wanted to do. "You and that big trap of yours, Di," Sonny hissed through clenched teeth as he bounded forward. "You never know when to keep it shut, do you? And let me tell you something else for nothing. I'd rather kill the no-good bastard than allow him to step another foot inside my house. My house!" he roared, stabbing a finger into his chest. "So you best tell him that I'm gunning for him, and believe me, sooner rather than later, I will end him over this." Diane raised her eyebrows, her red-painted talons more than ready to lash out at her husband if need be. "That's right. Resort to violence," she retorted, shaking her head. "That's all you're good for. At least my Bernie is a real man," she screamed in his face. "At least he's more than just a hired lackey." She gestured around the once immaculate bedroom, filled with expensive furniture, and sneered. "My Bernie knows how to treat a woman," she smirked. "And unlike you, he's going places. You're nothing but weak, tied to your brother's apron strings. They say jump and you ask how high. It's been that way ever since the day I met you. And if I didn't know any better, I'd say you're scared of them." She spread open her arms, her sneer intensifying as she pretended to quiver. "If only people knew the truth. The big Sonny Carter actually terrified of his own family." "You know fuck all," Sonny roared. "Don't I?" Diane screamed back at him. "I know that you'll never make anything of yourself. That 10 years from now, no, 20 years from now, you'll still be taking orders like the good little foot soldier you are." From her position on the floor, Carla watched as her daddy stepped back out of the room, his entire body trembling with rage. Scooping her up from the floor, he wrapped his strong arms around her and nuzzled his face into her hair, all the while taking deep breaths in an attempt to keep his temper at bay. "I'll come and see you soon, sweetheart. OK. Be a good girl for your mum." Carla could barely bring herself to answer, and as her father plonked her back on the floor, it took everything inside of her not to chase after him, to beg him to take her with him. "That's it," her mother screamed at his retreating back. "Run away like you always do. Is it any wonder I want a real man in my life?" Pausing at the top of the stairs, Sonny shook his head, his shoulders sagging. He looked so sad and so defeated that Carla wanted to cry all over again. It was in that instant Carla decided she didn't like her mum very much, at least not when she was screaming and shouting. And as for Bernie, as young as Carla was, she vowed to make him pay for what he'd caused. That one day, when she'd grown up She would make him suffer for tearing her perfect little family apart. Chapter 1. 2022. As far as family meetings went, the one currently being held at the Carter family scrapyard didn't disappoint. Not only was it standing room only, but the atmosphere was tense and tempers were beginning to flare. Sitting behind the desk in the portable cabin that doubled as both an office and meeting area, Jimmy Carter cracked his knuckles, his lips set into a thin line. For more than 2 hours, they had been at a standstill. Neither of his brothers willing to budge on the matter at hand, and if that wasn't bad enough, he had a flight to Spain booked for 9 p.m. Not that it looked as though he was going to make it. Story of his life. He'd lost count of how many times he'd missed a flight over the years. His elder brother, Tommy, had been the worst offender, doing everything in his power to keep Jimmy with him that little bit longer, finding last-minute jobs for Jimmy to do. In recent years, his youngest brother, Jonny, had become the main cause of him extending his stay. Jonny was reckless, and as much as it pained Jimmy to admit it, if it wasn't for the fact Jonny was family, that he knew how to handle a car, and that he excelled when it came to being the Carter family's getaway driver, then Jimmy would have kicked him to the curb years ago. In a lot of ways, Jonny reminded Jimmy of Tommy. Both were headstrong, not to mention a downright nightmare to work alongside. Yet despite his flaws, Jonny was also ambitious, and knew an opportunity when he saw one, and certainly didn't shy away from taking risks. Jimmy allowed himself a small smile, wondering how Tommy would have dealt with their youngest brother's antics. He would have had his work cut out for him. That much Jimmy did know. He took a quick glance at his watch, and silently groaned. If he didn't leave within the next 5 minutes, then he could say goodbye to his flight, and the amount of grief that would cause him didn't bear thinking about. His partner, Aidan, was bound to have something to say about the situation, not that Jimmy entirely blamed him. Time and time again he'd left Aidan in the lurch and expected him to run their bar in Spain single-handed, whilst he jumped on a plane without a moment's notice to sort out whichever latest mess his brothers had got themselves into. Then there were the armed robberies to contend with. The planning of each heist alone could take months, sometimes anything up to a year. And that was without the time spent actually staking a venue out. And being the meticulous person he was, Jimmy had insisted on being the one to personally oversee each and every robbery they carried out. Aware that all eyes had turned towards him, Jimmy leaned back in the chair and chewed thoughtfully on his bottom lip. As he did so, a familiar wave of tiredness washed over him. He was tired of the life. Exhausted, in fact. And the larger the family grew, the greater the responsibility became. Keeping both himself and his brothers and many nephews one step ahead of the police had finally begun to take its toll on him. He was forever on his guard, forever looking over his shoulder, half expecting the old Bill to appear out of nowhere and snap handcuffs upon his wrists. He'd never even wanted to be a part of the criminal underworld. Not really. It had been Tommy who dragged him along for the ride. Tommy who'd set them on the path as armed robbers. He cast his gaze over his younger brothers, Sonny and Mitchell, and was reminded once again that, like him, they too had been given no other choice but to join the family business. Unlike their youngest brother Jonny, who'd done everything in his power to follow on in his elder brother's footsteps. Well? Never one to have much patience, Jonny Carter sprang out of his seat, barely giving Sonny and Mitchell a second glance. By rights, they should have been the ones to lead the family, now that Jimmy had decided to retire and make a permanent move over to Spain. But Jonny had his eyes on the crown, and it was no secret that he wanted to be the one to give out the orders. "I can do this," he said, placing his hands on the desk with a determined look in his eyes. "You know I can." Jimmy sighed. He didn't doubt his youngest brother in the least. He took after Tommy after all. But Jonny didn't have the experience of planning out a heist, hence why the meeting had been called in the first place. It was going to be hard enough for Jimmy to hand over the reins and walk away from the only life he'd ever known, without the added pressure of knowing whether or not his younger brothers were capable enough to take over from him. Could he really trust Jonny to keep the family out of prison? He was under no illusions that their good luck was bound to run out at some point, that the slightest wrong move on their part could result in the Carter family receiving a capture, and they would more than likely have the book thrown at them and say goodbye to their freedom for the foreseeable future. He cast a glance towards Sonny and Mitchell, and couldn't help but take note of the fine lines around their eyes and the faint silver streaks coating their dark hair. His younger brothers were getting old, just as he himself was growing older, which was exactly the reason why he wanted to retire, to leave the family business behind him and live out the remainder of his life in Spain in relative peace. Carrying out armed robberies was a young man's game, and seeing as Jonny was their youngest brother, it made sense that he should take over, that he should be the one to lead the next generation of Carters.
"You're not seriously considering this, are you?"
The annoyance in Sonny Carter's voice was more than apparent. Getting to his feet, he spread open his arms and looked around him, first to his twin brother, Mitchell, and then his daughter and nephews who lined the walls of the office.
"Have you lost your mind? You honestly think he can be trusted to keep us, all of us,"
he reiterated, jerking his thumb around him,
"out of nick? He's a liability. He'll fuck up. You know he will. It's all he ever does. How many times have we had to bail him out over the years?"
he urged, his voice rising.
"How many times have we had to step in and sort him out?" "I am here, you know,"
Jonny grumbled, gesturing to himself.
"And since when have you ever planned out a robbery?" he added, his eyes blazing. "It's me who works out the routes. It's me who's responsible for getting us back here without so much as having a sniff of the old bill on our tail. You and Mitchell haven't got a Scooby, and you know it. Up until now," he said,
jabbing his finger onto the desktop to emphasise his point,
"you were more than happy to leave the planning to me and Jimmy. The only thing the two of you have ever had to worry about was turning up on time."
As Sonny began to protest, Jimmy held up his hand in a bid to quieten them down. The soft tick-tock that came from the clock on the wall, a stark reminder that he should have been on his way to the airport by now.
"Someone has to take over,"
he reminded his brothers. He lowered his voice a fraction and gave Sonny a pointed look.
"Do you really want the hag that comes along with running this place? The endless hours spent staking a venue out? The relentless worry that this time something could go wrong?"
Just as he'd known he would, Sonny averted his gaze. It may have only been slight, something that the rest of the family would never have picked up on, but it was enough for Jimmy to know that his gut instincts had been right all along. Despite his protests, Sonny didn't want the responsibility of leading the family, and even more than that, he didn't have the necessary drive to propel them forward, had never had it. Even when they'd been young men in their prime, Sonny had been more than happy to follow their eldest brother Tommy's lead. He was a follower, a sheep, much the same as his twin brother Mitchell. And as trustworthy as the two brothers may have been, they had never been hungry for power, a fact that Jimmy and even Tommy himself had been well aware of.
"Come on, Jimmy."
Jonny looked between his brothers, the excitement in his voice more than audible.
"One of us has to take over."
He lifted his eyebrows silently, beseeching Jimmy to choose him.
"Who is it going to be?"
Sinking back into the chair, Jimmy steepled his fingers, leaving the unanswered question thick in the air. The irritated sigh that came from Sonny was all the confirmation Jimmy needed. Not that he hadn't known all along that Jonny would be the one to take over from him, that neither Sonny nor Mitchell would fight for the position. In all honesty, the meeting had been nothing more than a farce. He'd needed each of his brothers to understand their standing within the family before he handed over the reins and walked away from them. And the last thing he wanted was for his family to be at loggerheads. Yet he knew instinctively that when it came down to it, Jonny wouldn't play fair, that he would scheme and plot his way to the top. Perhaps it would even come to blows between them. And seeing as theirs was a large family,
It had never taken much to set at least one of them off. They were notorious for their fallouts, and as loyal and protective of one another as they were, they could also be brutal when they needed to be. Jimmy took a quick glance at his watch, then rose to his feet. Digging his hand into his pocket, he took out the keys for the scrapyard and looked down at them. He'd always imagined that he would find it difficult when it came to handing them over, but in truth it wasn't. That wasn't to say, however, that he wasn't worried for his family's future, because he was. How could he not be? He'd looked out for them for so long it had almost become second nature to him. But at the end of the day, he'd done his time, had done his part in keeping the family safe. He tossed the keys across to his youngest brother, eager to be rid of them. "Don't let me down," he said in a warning, his expression suddenly becoming menacing. The triumphant grin that was spread across Jonny's face intensified. "I won't," he answered, gripping the keys tightly in his fist. Jimmy nodded. At the back of his mind, he was still somewhat unsure that Jonny understood exactly what he was taking on, or that any of his brothers truly knew what it meant to be the head of the Carter family. Not that he himself had had any real insight into the sacrifices he would have had to make for the family all those years ago when he'd taken over from Tommy. Only in his case, he'd never been given a choice. There'd been no meeting to decide who would take over. After Tommy's murder, he had been the next eldest, and so whether he'd wanted the position or not, it had been presumed that he would be the natural successor. And he'd done a good job of it too. The fact they'd never so much as ever been brought in for questioning over a robbery had been testament to that fact. He took a moment to study his youngest brother. Already, Jonny was eyeing up the desk that until now had belonged to Jimmy. The family's future would fall upon Jonny's shoulders. Every quarrel, disagreement, or feud would now become Jonny's sole responsibility. And Jimmy knew from experience that there would always be someone, somewhere, with a grudge to bear. It stood to reason, seeing as theirs was a family that was both notorious and feared in equal measures. Carla Carter crossed one shapely leg over the other. Outwardly, she appeared impassive, perhaps even bored, as she listened to her father and uncles argue over who would be taking over the business. Inwardly, however, her stomach was tied up in knots. As much as she loved her dad, and she really did love him, she wanted her Uncle Jonny to become Jimmy's successor. Sonny was too straight-laced. Same went for her Uncle Mitchell, too. They didn't take unnecessary risks, and certainly wouldn't entertain carrying out a robbery in the name of revenge. But her Uncle Jonny, on the other hand, he was hungry. He wanted to prove that he had what it took to execute the perfect crime. Not only was he ruthless, but he also knew an opportunity when he saw one. And as it just so happened, Carla knew the perfect venue they could rob. As they filed out of the office, Carla watched her father as he headed for his car. The slight tension across his shoulder blades alerted her to the fact that he wasn't happy Jonny had been chosen over him. Not that she could say she particularly blamed him. He'd spent his entire life preparing for this moment, knowing that one day Jimmy would retire, and that the business, whether he wanted it to or not, would fall into his hands. And the fact he'd been bypassed had to have stung, bringing with it further confirmation that Jimmy didn't think he was good enough, that neither he nor Mitchell had what it took to run the business. In that instant, she felt a moment of pity for him. Her dad was too nice for his own good. He would never have argued his case, would never have gone up against Jimmy's decision. When Jimmy said jump, her dad asked how high. Not that her dad wasn't able to take care of himself, because he could. Time and time again, she'd heard Jimmy state that Sonny had a blinding right hook on him, that out of all his brothers, Sonny was the one he was more wary of. He had a quietness about him, a calmness, that over the years others had mistakenly taken for weakness. It was only when the red mist descended that those who had taken Sonny for a fool realised that beneath the facade, he was a dangerous individual. "Dad," she softly called out to him, "are you okay?" Sonny paused, and as he turned around to face Carla, she could see just how weary he was. He'd never remarried after his divorce. Unlike her mum, who hadn't been able to walk down the aisle fast enough, much to Carla's disgust. Despite her dad's reluctance to remarry, Carla wasn't naive enough to think there had never been any other women in his life. He was a good-looking man, after all, a catch, not to mention wealthy. Women fell at his feet. She'd even witnessed their shameless flirting with her own 2 eyes. But to her knowledge, there had never been anyone special. Perhaps her mum had put him off women for life. Carla knew firsthand just how difficult her mum Diane could be. Despite their divorce, she'd done everything in her power to make life hard for Sonny. It was almost as though she resented him, as though he were the one who had done wrong and that she wanted to make him suffer for leaving her. At the drop of a hat, she would restrict his visits with his only child and would take great pleasure in watching him beg for contact. Was it any wonder that Carla felt contempt for her mother? And as for Bernie, her mother's husband, Carla despised him, and always had. Sonny gave a shrug, and closing the car door, he made his way over to his daughter. "If you want my opinion, Jimmy has lost the plot. Why else would he have handed the reins over to Jonny? He's going to bring us down," he warned, glaring at the office. "Give it 6 months and it'll be game over. You mark my words. Every single last one of us will end up in handcuffs and be carted off to the nearest nick." Carla glanced behind her. Maybe her dad was right. Jonny was young, after all. But in his defence, her uncles had been a lot younger when they'd first set out. Her dad had only been a teenager, barely out of school when he'd robbed his first bank. And Jonny was no fool. He'd been taught by the best. She took a deep breath, debating within herself how best to answer. She couldn't let her dad see just how thrilled she was at the prospect of Jonny taking over. "Jimmy knows what he's doing." "Then Jimmy's deluded," Sonny balked. "Jonny can barely rein himself in. What hope does he have with that lot?" Carla followed her father's gaze to where her cousins loitered on the forecourt. They were a rowdy bunch, some worse than others. Perhaps her dad had a point. Would Jonny actually be able to control them? Not that her dad or Uncle Mitchell would have fared any better, especially when it came to Thomas, or Tommy Jr., as he was more commonly known. Technically, Thomas was her cousin's son and her Uncle Tommy's grandson, and although he may have gone by the surname Johnson, his genes were strong, and he had more Carter blood flowing through his veins than the rest of the family combined, seeing as her cousins Karen and Cameron were Tommy Jr.'s parents, and that both his maternal and paternal grandfathers had been brothers. On more than one occasion, she'd heard her dad state that Thomas would need to be watched, that in the wrong hands, he would be dangerous. She gave a shudder. She was fond of Tommy Jr. He was a good kid, albeit hard to handle at times. A short while later, Carla made her way towards the office. For as long as she could remember, all she'd ever wanted was to be a part of her family's world, for her father to treat her as he did her male cousins. And after much persuasion on her part, her dad had finally relented, giving her a glimpse into what it was that made the Carter family tick. Growing up, she'd known that both her father and uncles were notorious, that their reputations made them both feared and respected amongst the local community. But until she joined the family business, she hadn't known the exact reason why. Oh, she wasn't daft. Many a time she'd questioned just how it was that they had made their money, and knew for a fact the vast wealth couldn't have come from the scrapyard alone. How could it, when each of her uncles and her father lived a life of luxury? Pausing at the door, she shook her head. Jonny lounged back on the chair, his hands locked behind his head, his feet up on the desk, and a satisfied expression spread across his face. "Congratulations." Startled, Jonny scrambled to take his feet down, his cheeks flaming red. "Carla," he said, pulling a pile of paperwork towards him in an attempt to hide his embarrassment. Sinking into a chair, Carla couldn't help but laugh out loud. He looked so like her dad. A younger version, of course. All the Carters looked alike. Each of them a carbon copy of one another, herself included. There could never be any mistaking that Sonny was her father. "I see you've already made yourself at home." She paused for a moment,
then nodded towards the desk.
Suits you.
Jonny narrowed his eyes.
Is that a sly dig? He asked, not taking his eyes away from his niece. Because if it is, then your dad could have fought for it, he said, pointing towards the forecourt. He had ample opportunity to sway Jimmy's mind.
Carla shook her head.
We both know my dad didn't want this place.
She gestured around the cramped space that hadn't changed in all the years she'd been coming to the scrapyard. Even the potted plant tucked into the corner of the office, the leaves brown and dry, and the ceramic pot cracked and chipped in places, had been there for years. Why no one had had the sense to throw it out, she didn't know. It wasn't as though a sprinkling of water was going to miraculously bring the plant back to life.
Not really. Not deep down in here, she said, tapping her chest.
Jonny gave a carefree shrug. If he felt any form of remorse, then he didn't show it. Not that Carla had actually expected him to.
What can I do for you then, Carla? Because I have a feeling you didn't come in here just to congratulate me.
Carla flashed a smile, and leaning slightly forward, her long dark hair fell around her shoulders.
I have a proposition for you.
Let me guess, Jonny grinned. It's one that I won't be able to refuse.
Something like that.
Straightening up, Carla looked her uncle in the eyes.
It's the one thing that will really cement that crown on your head. The one thing no one in our family has ever been able to achieve.
Almost immediately, Carla could see the wheels turning in Jonny's head. He was more than a little intrigued. And as he sat back in the chair, she mirrored his stance, her expression becoming serious, businesslike.
Diamonds, she said,
watching his reaction closely.
I just so happen to know where to find some. And if that wasn't enough, she said, with a wicked gleam in her eyes, they've got our names written all over them.
Chapter 2. Stacey Mackay pulled her dressing gown tighter around her and shook her head. She wasn't entirely surprised to see her former brother-in-law back on her doorstep only hours after he'd said his goodbyes. All along she should have known he would miss his flight, just as he'd missed countless flights before now.
Get yourself in, she chuckled. The spare bedroom is still made up for you.
Jimmy smiled his thanks.
I'll be out of your hair first thing in the morning, he promised.
Oh, get away with you.
Stacey flapped her hand.
You know we love having you over to stay, and who knows how long it will be until your next visit.
As he followed Stacey through to the sitting room, Jimmy rolled his eyes.
Somehow I've got a feeling that I'll be back a lot sooner than I'd anticipated.
With a frown upon her face, Stacey spun around.
What do you mean by that?
Jimmy shrugged, and taking a seat on the sofa, he offered a small smile.
I handed the reins over to Jonny.
Wearily, Stacey closed her eyes.
And I bet that went down like a lead balloon, she sighed.
Me and Danny, she said, nodding towards her second husband as he entered the room,
we're convinced that you choose Sonny and Mitchell to take over from you.
It went down exactly as I expected it would, Jimmy answered. Sonny and Mitchell didn't put up a fight, and until the boys...
His voice trailed off, and he nodded towards the portraits of Stacey's sons that lined the mantelpiece.
Well, if the time ever comes and Peter or Jake want to take over the reins, then it's theirs. Goes without saying.
Stacey gasped.
Over my dead bloody body, they will. Have you lost your mind? She hissed. That you think I'd ever let my boys run the business?
Stacey's husband cleared his throat.
It is their business, Stace, he reminded his wife. The scrapyard belonged to Tommy, and as his sons, whether you like it or not, they have rights.
What rights?
Stacey scoffed with a shake of her head. She pointed a stiff finger towards Jimmy.
It's bad enough that they work for the business, let alone run it. And you're a fine one to talk, she said,
turning her attention back to her husband. Her lips pursed.
You don't want your Logan to follow on in your footsteps, she said, referring to Danny's son. In fact, you did everything in your power to push him into college, for him to make a legitimate career for himself.
Danny sighed, and holding up his hands, he settled himself into the armchair.
Fair point, he conceded. Not that his son was as far away from the criminal underworld as he would have liked. Her earlier anger somewhat subsiding, Stacey joined Jimmy on the sofa. Johnny's not daft. He's had his moments, admittedly, and let's face it, plenty of them over the years, but he isn't stupid. He wouldn't take any unnecessary risks, especially not now. Not when he's about to become a father. He'd have too much to lose. Jimmy sighed, and as he looked between Stacey and Danny, he lifted his shoulders, his expression one of concern. I hope you're right, Stace. Because up here, he said, tapping his temple, I can't help but think I fucked up. That maybe I should have chosen Sonny and Mitchell. He gave a shake of his head, his forehead furrowing. They'd play it safe. You know that as well as I do. Stacey clutched Jimmy's hand. She understood his worry, and as her gaze drifted back to the photographs of her sons, a feeling of dread swept over her. Both her sons' and grandsons' futures rested in Johnny's hands. All it would take was one mistake, and it could very well be game over. They would more than likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars. As much as she hated to admit it, perhaps she was partly to blame that her sons had followed in their father's footsteps. It had been far easier on her part to turn a blind eye when it came to her first husband's chosen occupation, for her to pretend that the money Tommy Carter had accumulated over the years had come from legal sources, rather than armed robberies. Her heart began to race. Maybe you're right, she said, giving Jimmy's hand a tight squeeze, her voice a lot higher than she'd intended. Go on, you've got my attention. Carla smiled. Of course she had Johnny's attention. She'd known that from the very moment the word diamond had slipped out of her mouth. Bernie, she began. Johnny screwed up his face. You mean your stepdad? The smile slipped from Carla's face. He's not my stepdad, she snapped. Listen, Johnny gave a gentle smile. Admittedly, I'd be the first to hold up my hands and agree that Bernie is a first-class prick. But when him and your old man used to knock about together as kids, he was actually all right. He could be a bit flash at times, a bit cocky, I suppose, he shrugged. But that was about it. I liked him. We all did. And whether you like it or not, he said, stabbing his finger forward, he's married to your mum, and in my book, that makes him your stepdad. Carla shook her head. In her eyes, Bernie Adams was nothing more than her mother's husband, and to think of him as anything else was the equivalent of betraying her dad, and she'd already betrayed Sonny enough by secretly rooting for Johnny to take control of the business. It doesn't matter what he is or isn't, she spat through clenched teeth. My point is, he has diamonds in his possession. Johnny laughed out loud. Give over, Carls. Do you honestly think I'm going to put myself out and rob him of a few measly diamond rings? I've become a laughing-stock. Crossing her arms over her chest, Carla's expression could only be described as smug. Who said anything about rings? She sat forward in the chair and lifted her eyebrows. I'm talking about diamonds. Lots and lots of diamonds. On a daily basis, Bernie Adams liked to give others the impression that he was loaded, that he could afford to buy whatever his heart desired. On his wrist, he wore a flashy timepiece that had cost thousands of pounds. And wherever possible, he made a point of only dining out at the most expensive of restaurants. In truth, however, his vast fortune had all but dwindled down to nothing. Oh, he still owned a large mock Tudor mansion on the outskirts of Essex, or at least he did until his debts finally caught up with him, and bailiffs turned up at the property, promptly turfing him and his wife out on their ears. In fact, it was only because of the second and the subsequent third mortgage he'd taken out on the property, not forgetting the various credit cards he'd secretly taken out in both his and his wife Diane's names, that he was still able to drive a car that was guaranteed to turn heads, and could also afford to splash out on bottles of champagne that cost more than what most men earned in a week. In his line of work, it was all about image. He had to be seen as doing well for himself, and even more than that, he had to keep up the pretence that life was on the up. But when it came down to what he actually had in his bank account, he had very little to his name, something that neither Diane nor his business associates were aware of. Was it any wonder that he'd found himself becoming embroiled with the Tucker family,
They'd presented him with an opportunity he couldn't resist, and being desperate for a solution to his money troubles, he'd taken it with both hands. Not only that, but being associated with the Tuckers was bound to open other doors, which as far as he was concerned could only be a bonus. He needed more cash, needed a way to dig himself out of the hole he found himself in. Weaving his way through a private members' club a few streets away from King's Cross Station, a wide smile was plastered across Bernie's face. Despite the fact it was still early evening, the scent of cigar smoke and expensive aftershave assaulted his nostrils. The club screamed of money, and from the very moment Bernie had stepped through the doors, he'd felt at home. It was all about show, he decided. It made no difference that he was broke, that he didn't have a proverbial pot to piss in. Dressed in a dark suit and a pristine white shirt, the cuffs secured with solid gold cufflinks, he looked the part, and in Bernie's world that was all that mattered. Towards the rear of the club, he came to a halt in front of a table, his grin still held firmly in place.
"Ozzy?"
He nodded in a greeting before turning to look at the man sitting beside him.
"Lenny?"
He didn't bother to address the remaining firm members at the table. Why should he, when by their own admission they were nothing more than hired muscle?
"Bernie?"
Returning the greeting, Ozzy Tucker flicked his head towards an empty chair. As always, an ever-present scowl was etched across his face, his beady eyes observing everything and everyone around him. Bernie's grin intensified, and with an air of confidence he pulled out the chair and took a seat, all the while tearing his gaze away from the man sitting upon Ozzy's lap. He would have never said it out loud for fear of repercussions, but the man's presence unnerved him. It was the way the man watched him, the way his hard stare seemed to be able to penetrate into Bernie's skull. It was almost as though he'd been able to suss out the truth, that beneath the facade Bernie liked to put on for those around him, he was nothing more than a fraudster, a man who was so desperate that he'd befriended the Tuckers for his own gain. And let's face it, there was no other reason why he would have sought the Tuckers out. They weren't exactly men who could be trusted. They weren't even likeable. In fact, he could barely recall anyone who actually had a good word to say about them. He watched as the man, who called himself Sadie, whispered something into Ozzy's ear before detangling himself from his embrace and sashaying across the club. It took everything in Bernie's power not to stare after him, his eyes hard. Sadie had to be pushing 50 if he was a day, and if the rumours were anything to go by, he'd only recently been released from prison after serving a long stretch inside for murder. From the corner of his eye, Bernie glanced towards the Tuckers' henchmen. If any of them felt the same sense of unease that he did, then they didn't show it. Not that it would have been in any of their best interests to openly show any form of contempt. Out of the two brothers, it was well known that Ozzy was the more unhinged, that at the best of times he could be a paranoid bugger, and as such should be treated with kid gloves, or better still, given a wide berth.
"Are the diamonds safe?"
It was Lenny who spoke, and nodding his head furiously, Bernie resisted the urge to swipe the droplets of sweat from his upper lip. Of course the diamonds were safe. He wasn't stupid. As soon as they'd been pushed into his hands, he'd placed them inside the cast-iron safe nestled at the bottom of his wardrobe. He'd never even told his wife the combination code, too afraid that the nosy cow would snoop through his most prized possessions the very moment his back was turned.
"Good."
Lighting a cigarette, Lenny pointed the burning embers in Bernie's direction.
"Make sure it stays that way."
Bernie swallowed deeply. It would be more than his life was worth to allow anything to happen to the merchandise, and he was under no false pretences that if the police were to ever raid his home and find the stolen gems in his possession, that he would be the one to end up doing time, and that was only if the Tuckers didn't find a way to silence him first. He wouldn't put anything past the brothers. They could make him disappear if they so wished, and when it came down to it, other than Diane, there was no one else who would actually miss him. He had no other family, didn't even have many friends, at least none who would question his absence. As for Ozzy and Lenny Tucker, they'd made no secret of the fact that they viewed him as dispensable, the weakest link in their firm. It was one of the only reasons they'd brought him in to work with them.
"Don't you worry."
He tapped the side of his nose, his voice full of mock bravado. "Believe me when I say this. They're locked up tighter than the crown jewels." It was a slight exaggeration, considering where he'd stashed the diamonds, but he wasn't about to admit this fact out loud, and certainly not to the Tuckers of all people. "You know what I'm like," he said, puffing out his chest with a measure of self-importance. "I don't mess around when it comes to the goods." Lenny Tucker leaned back in his chair, his gaze firmly fixed on Bernie as he continued to smoke his cigarette. "Talking of messing around," he said, stroking the grey stubble across his jaw. "How's that wife of yours doing?" Instantly Bernie's spine straightened, the hidden innuendo behind Lenny's words making the men around the table snigger. It would be fair to say that his wife Diane had been around the block more than once, and that was before she'd even married Sonny Carter. And if she could do the dirty on Sonny, then he was more than aware that there was nothing stopping her from doing the same to him too. "She's okay?" he shrugged in an attempt to brush the question off. Lenny smirked. "Nice woman, your Diane," he said, pointing the cigarette forward again. "Knows how to have a good time. What was it they used to call her back in the day?" He tilted his head to the side as though thinking the question over. "Oh, yeah, that was it. Pass the parcel. I mean, that was one of the nicer terms, of course. Believe me, there were plenty of other slurs they used to describe her. Yeah," he said, looking into the distance. "Your Diane was a girl, all right, and always up for it, if you know what I mean. And as for us lads, well, it would have been rude to say no, wouldn't it?" He flashed Bernie a wink. "Great times they were." Nausea made its way up Bernie's throat, and as he shifted his weight, his earlier good mood quickly evaporated. At a loss for something to say, he turned his head and beckoned for a waiter. He needed a drink, and fast, needed something to distract his attention from the all-too-knowing sneers around him. Moments later, he knocked back a measure of whiskey, hoping more than anything else that the alcohol would help erase the sickening images that had entered his mind, mainly of Diane and Lenny Tucker in various stages of undress on his king-sized bed, the crisp cotton sheets crumpled beneath them. A scenario he knew only too well, seeing as he and Diane had once been in an all-too-familiar position. Except back then, the bed had belonged to Sonny Carter, his former childhood friend. Perhaps this was his karma, his punishment for betraying Sonny in one of the worst ways imaginable. The thought was as depressing as it was sobering. Jonny Carter narrowed his eyes. "How the fuck did Bernie manage to get his grubby mitts on a stash of diamonds?" Leaning forward, Carla rested her forearms on the desk that separated them. "He's looking after them." She gave a slight shake of her head, her patience beginning to wear thin. "Does it really matter how he came by them?" she asked. "Of course it matters." Jonny threw up his hands. "This isn't a game we're playing. If, and this is only an if at this point," he warned, stabbing his finger forward, "I agree to this, then I need to know where they've come from, because I'm going to take a wild guess and say that Bernie wasn't the one who lifted them." He screwed up his face, his dislike of the man who had all but destroyed his brother's marriage clearly visible. "He might be a lot of things, but to have the gall to carry out a robbery isn't one of them." Carla sighed, and as she looked down at her hands, she picked at her nail varnish. As much as she hated to admit it, her nerves were beginning to get the better of her. What would happen if Jonny was to turn her down? She couldn't go to her dad or her Uncle Mitchell. They would refuse point blank to even hear her out, let alone consider her plan for revenge, especially where diamonds were concerned. "I overheard him and my mum talking," she answered, looking up. "The way he was carrying on, you'd think he was some kind of big shot." Her lip curled in disgust, as it always did whenever she was forced to speak about her mother's husband. "He wasn't even involved in the actual robbery. Like I said, he's only looking after them until they can be shipped out." "Which brings me back to my original question," Jonny replied, his voice tight. "Where did they come from?" Taking a deep breath, Carla raised her eyebrows. Instinctively, she knew this would be the moment when Jonny would refuse her request, no matter how much his interest might be piqued. "Lenny and Ozzy Tucker." Jonny's eyes widened, his expression one of shock. "The Tuckers? he exclaimed. Carla nodded. But, deep in thought, Jonny shook his head. How did they? He paused and cocked his head to the side. You mean to tell me it was them? That they were responsible for that heist over in Hatton Garden? Carla nodded again. That's what I'm guessing. She gave a small smile. The Tuckers had only been in the game for a short time, and already they'd managed to achieve the one thing that her family hadn't. 3 times her dad and uncles had attempted to steal a diamond from Hatton Garden, and each time their attempt had been thwarted to the point that they had all but given up even trying. They'd often referred to the failed heists as more than just a run of bad luck, but as a bad omen, a gut instinct telling them that they needed to stay as far away from the gems as they possibly could. As she watched the different emotions flicker across Jonny's face, Carla forced herself to relax. The Tucker brothers had been a thorn in her family's side for a number of years, so much so that at one point a war had been on the cards. It had been Tommy Jr. who had taken the initial brunt of their vendetta. The fact his late grandfathers had been brothers had been all the ammunition the Tuckers had needed, and still, to this day, they openly refer to him as being inbred. And even though the two families had eventually called somewhat of a truce, her dad and uncle's dislike for Lenny and Ozzie Tucker was still so tangible that she could almost taste it. "What are you thinking?" Crossing her fingers, her breathing became hitched in anticipation of his answer. "What do you think?" As he cracked his knuckles, Jonny flashed a wide grin. "I'd give anything to see those fuckers brought down." Leaning back in the chair, he looked into the distance. "Only problem is, though," he flicked his head towards the forecourt, his expression becoming serious, "your old man and Mitchell. They'll never agree to it." Lifting her eyebrows, Carla made sure to keep the hint of a grin that threatened to crease her face at bay. "And there was me thinking that you were the one in charge now." She leaned in closer and lowered her voice a fraction. "You're the head of the Carter family." She smiled sweetly. "They take orders from you now."